If we want to talk about what's causing all the climate chaos that we're dealing with, we have to talk about methane. This greenhouse gas is even more powerful than carbon dioxide, and it's leaking into the atmosphere from all sorts of places. But even though tracking it down is hard, cutting methane could be surprisingly easy and have huge effects. And if we play our cards right, methane could actually save us from a whole lot of climate change. I'm Adam, a climate scientist with a PhD from Oxford, sharing what you need to know about climate change. And right now I am in the middle of moving, as you can see, which is why this video looks very early era ClimateAdam. I promise I'll make an effort to make my future videos look a little bit nicer again. More pressingly, today I want to talk about one of the most important greenhouse gases that we're emitting. Methane. Then why do we always talk about carbon dioxide? Well, that's because CO2 is causing more global warming than anything else. But it's not the only thing that we're emitting that's heating up the planet. And in second place is methane. And it's still a huge deal for our climate. Thanks to us humans dumping so much of it into the atmosphere, there's now 2.5 times more of it in our air than there was before the Industrial Revolution. So where's all this methane coming from? Well, methane is produced by a whole host of natural and human sources. Natural sources include things like wetlands, volcanoes, and termites? Termites? And what about the human sources? Humans have been adding to all this methane with things like fossil fuels, food production, and trash dumps. We'll come back to those and what we can do about them in just a moment. And we'll come back to the natural stuff and how it might not be so natural after all towards the end of the video. So don't go anywhere just yet. Okay, fine, I won't go anywhere. But you mentioned methane is a greenhouse gas. Right. So how's it any different to CO2? Well, the gas is made up of a completely different molecule. Carbon dioxide is, clues in the name, a carbon with 2 oxygens. And methane is, well, there's no clue in that name, but a methane is a carbon with 4 hydrogen atoms. Oh, great. Always good to know about atoms. But what does that actually mean? How does it behave any differently? Well, ton for ton, it has a much more powerful greenhouse effect than CO2. But because there's much less of it in the atmosphere, overall it's causing less global warming than carbon dioxide. But its strength isn't the only big difference. Once carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, it can stick around for hundreds, even thousands of years. Methane, on the other hand, has a relatively short lifespan, lasting only around a decade. So it's pretty intense, but doesn't last very long. Which reminds me of... Anyway, how do these two things end up balancing each other out? Well, you kind of have to think about both of these factors at the same time. So, for example, climate scientists will say things like, methane is 80 times more powerful than CO2 over a 20-year period. And honestly, there's a lot of intense scientific debate about how we should compare methane emissions to CO2 emissions. This could have major implications for how we cut what, when. But ultimately the main point is this: methane is heating the planet loads, and it would be great if it didn't. So we should cut it. Okay, well, how do we cut methane emissions? Well, to discuss that, we need to discuss how exactly humans are emitting methane in the first place. Okay, so how exactly are humans emitting methane in the first place? Great question. Our biggest source of methane is farming, and the worst culprits are these bad boys, cows and sheep. Contrary to popular belief, their farts aren't actually the big issue. It's mostly their burps that are emitting massive amounts of this greenhouse gas straight into the atmosphere. Now, there is one obvious solution to that. Eat less beef, lamb, and dairy products. And if you've seen my videos on the climate impact of our diets, you'll already know that that's one of the biggest ways we can cut the emissions of what we munch. Right, along with limiting food waste. Right. But obviously the world's not going to stop eating these foods completely or overnight, and there are other ways to cut down the methane from cattle. like seaweed. Researchers have found that adding key ingredients like red algae seaweed to cows' food prevents microorganism in the cow's first stomach from making methane, potentially cutting emissions in the burps by up to 90%. But we still don't know enough about the long-term impacts, so there's a lot of work to be done before techniques like this get widely adopted. But these animals aren't the only food with a massive methane footprint. And the next one honestly surprised me when I first learnt about it. Rice. You didn't even mention rice in your food video. Yeah, I know. And that's because gram for gram, rice has pretty tiny emissions when compared to foods like beef or lamb. But globally, we grow a huge amount of grams of rice, and that ends up causing a lot of methane emissions. You see, rice is grown in flooded fields. Underwater, the oxygen gets depleted. When microbes munch matter in these conditions, they produce a whole bunch of methane. So what do we do about this rice methane? Well, since the problem's caused by flooded fields, we can flood the fields less, like alternating between flooding them and drying them out. Tests in countries like China and Vietnam show this could halve methane emissions and potentially boost yields and cut water use. And there are other tricks we could use too, like new strains of rice and even adding fish to the flooded fields. Okay, but that's enough about food, because there's another huge methane culprit, and it is the classic climate change culprit. I'll give you a clue. It rhymes with schmossel schmules. Of course. Colossal mules. No, it's fossil fuels. Well, that was going to be my second guess. Getting hold of fossil fuels leads to methane from a whole host of processes, which is hardly surprising because what we call natural gas is pretty much just methane. The big issues from oil and gas production are leaks, as well as flaring and venting. Flaring and venting are when gas from oil production is burnt or just dumped into the atmosphere instead of being captured and used. So the solutions aren't exactly rocket science. Detect and repair leaks and ban non-emergency flaring and venting. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, proposes a pathway for cutting down on methane from the fossil fuel industry, which they reckon would cost around $15 billion a year. That sounds pretty expensive. It does, but it's actually an awesome deal, because the methane captured actually has value to the fossil fuel industry. So the IEA suggestion would cut methane from these sectors by 3/4. The companies would lose no money doing this, and the world would gain from not having all that methane dumped into the atmosphere. I feel like there's a catch coming. Well, the catch that's coming is that it's the responsibility of the fossil fuel companies to sort this out. And how's that been going? Yeah, not great. Fossil fuel companies have been failing to report and, more importantly, do anything about all the methane they're dumping into the atmosphere. According to the IEA, methane emissions implied by existing oil and gas company reporting are 95% lower than IEA's estimate. Yeesh. Yeesh is the correct response, and we'll be coming back to that yeesh in a little bit. But first, I have something really rubbish I have to tell you, which is that rubbish is responsible for a huge amount of methane emissions. Despite tough competition, I think that could be the worst joke that you have ever made. Okay, but look. Stuff decaying and releasing methane in landfill is a huge problem, but there are also easy ways to sort it out. We can separate out organic waste, like food waste, and we can cover landfill to help microbes in this cover absorb the methane that's produced. And finally, the methane that is still produced can be captured and used. Not only do these steps cut the greenhouse gas emissions, but they can also cut down on the landfill's smell and fire risk, which can make them pretty popular with people who hate smelly landfill fires. I hear that's quite a broad demographic. And speaking of appealing to a broad demographic, oh no, I feel a sponsor message message coming on. Actually, no. I don't want the point of my videos to be selling you folks stuff you don't need, so I don't do sponsorships or even turn monetization on. Videos like this are entirely supported by my incredible patrons. Join them up here or wait for the link at the end of the video. And speaking of waiting, I'm still waiting to find out what actually happens when we cut methane emissions. Well, that's the awesome thing. Because methane doesn't last long in the atmosphere, it works really differently to CO2. So if we suddenly stopped emitting CO2 but kept everything else the same in the atmosphere, that would basically halt global warming, because the CO2 sticks around for ages. Exactly. So things would stop getting hotter, but they wouldn't get colder either. But if we did the same thing for methane, temperatures would actually start decreasing as the amounts of methane in the atmosphere gradually dropped. So that means that cutting methane isn't just about cutting global warming, it actually helps reverse it. Now, this isn't some easy shortcut. We still need to cut CO2, and in practice, cutting methane doesn't actually mean we cool the planet back down. That's thanks to all the other things we're emitting and cutting. But still, cutting methane would be a huge climate win. And there's another benefit too. You see, methane helps form ozone near the ground. But isn't ozone good? Well, the ozone layer high up in the atmosphere is good, but ozone near the ground gets breathed in by us, which sucks because it's a major form of air pollution. And so cutting methane would cut this ozone and help cut the hundreds of thousands of ozone-related deaths every year. And so, for our lungs and for the climate, lots of suggestions for how we should cut emissions say we should be cutting methane super quickly right now, especially given how easy, low-tech and cheap loads of methane cutting solutions are. I mean, we're talking about things like covering trash with soil and plugging leaks here. It's hardly nuclear fusion. So cutting methane is a huge, easy to achieve win. So how quickly are we cutting methane? We're not. What? We're not cutting methane. In fact, the opposite. Concentrations are still going up. And the frustrating thing is, we're still working out why. That's because methane comes from so many different human and natural processes, it can be hard to pin down. Most of this rise seems to be coming from methane made by microbes, for example in cows' stomachs or on trash heaps. But researchers also reckon that methane emissions from fossil fuels have been increasing. Despite that bad news, there is progress. Like the US and the EU are pushing companies to monitor and repair leaks better. And we're getting better and better at seeing where methane is coming from. Because methane is invisible, we need special sensors. Stuff on land or flying in the skies, or even satellites. Satellites are playing a bigger and bigger role in tracking down where major methane emissions are coming from. And hopefully that means we can get better at stopping these emissions from our activities. But not all the methane is coming from our activities. Right, you said a lot of natural stuff emits methane too. But all that natural stuff is changing thanks to us humans. Scientists are concerned that one of the big reasons that concentrations are still going up is because nature is speeding up its methane release as we heat up the planet. So how can we see what nature's doing today and what it could do tomorrow? And could these natural changes even pass a point of no return? These seem like big questions that'll take time to answer, perhaps in a completely separate video coming soon. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And speaking of subscribers, I cannot believe that we're almost at 50,000 of you climates in this community. I'm definitely planning a special celebration for when we reach that milestone, including hopefully a handstand on a skateboard. But in the meantime, here's what actually happens if we suddenly stopped emitting. Okay, until next time. Bye. It's a really dumb joke.